April 8, 1952. Compound 76, Geoje Island, Korea. Lieutenant Chen Wei pressed his face against the rusted wire mesh, watching something that shattered 3 years of communist indoctrination in a single moment. An American military chaplain stood atop a wooden crate, speaking in broken Mandarin to 300 Chinese prisoners who knelt barefoot on the cold gravel, heads bowed in prayer. The psychological demolition of Maoist ideology was about to begin, not through propaganda or coercion, but through the simple act of allowing enemies to worship their God. The morning air carried the metallic tang of engine oil from nearby work details, the sharp scent of fermented vegetables from communal kitchens, and the rough scratch of wool blankets that men clutched around their shoulders against the damp island wind. Chaplain Robert Morrison balanced precariously on his makeshift pulpit, a donated ammunition box that creaked under his weight, while Korean interpreters whispered simultaneous translations into clusters of listening ears. Chen Wei had grown up in Shandong province, where Communist Party cadres had spent years convincing peasants that religion was the opium of the masses, a Western poison designed to weaken Chinese resolve. Churches had been shuttered, priests imprisoned, and Christian converts forced into re-education camps. The party taught that Americans used religion as a weapon of cultural imperialism, a tool to make proud Chinese people submissive and weak. Yet here stood an American officer, voluntarily entering a compound filled with enemy soldiers, offering them access to the very faith his government had supposedly weaponized. The Geneva Convention of 1949 had guaranteed that prisoners of war shall enjoy complete latitude in the exercise of their religious duties, including attendance at the service of their faith. American camp commanders took this obligation seriously, not just as legal requirement, but as demonstration of democratic values. What they hadn't anticipated was how profoundly this freedom would affect men who had never witnessed it. Geoje Island stretched 8 miles across the Korea Strait, a windswept outcrop of rock and scrub grass that had been transformed into the largest prisoner of war complex in UN history. By spring 1952, the island housed over 170,000 North Korean and Chinese prisoners in dozens of compounds, each one organized like a small city with sleeping barracks, communal mess halls, work details, and parade grounds where men gathered for daily roll call. Compound 76 alone held 6,000 Chinese prisoners, veterans of the People's Liberation Army who had crossed the Yalu River, believing they were fighting American imperialists bent on enslaving Asian peoples. They had been told American soldiers would torture prisoners, force them to betray their homeland, and strip them of all human dignity. Instead, they discovered Americans who allowed them to pray. Morrison's service lasted 20 minutes. He spoke of forgiveness, redemption, and the inherent worth of every human soul. Men who had been taught that Americans viewed Chinese as racially inferior watched an enemy officer treat them with respect that exceeded what many had received from their own commanders. When Morrison asked those interested in learning more about Christianity to remain after the service, over 200 prisoners stayed. Chen Wei watched from the wire as men who had charged American positions with fixed bayonets just months earlier now lined up to receive pocket New Testaments printed in simplified Chinese characters. The irony was staggering. Communist propaganda had claimed Americans sought to destroy Chinese culture. Yet here they were, preserving it, printing religious texts in Chinese script that prisoners could read and understand. The camp architecture itself told a story of American industrial capacity that contradicted everything prisoners had been taught about Western weakness. Wooden barracks stretched in neat rows, each building housing 200 men on 2-tier bunks with straw mattresses. Electric generators provided lighting after dark. Mess halls could serve thousands simultaneously. Latrine facilities, while basic, included running water and waste disposal systems more sophisticated than what most prisoners had known in rural China. But the most profound shock wasn't material comfort. It was freedom. Freedom to worship, freedom to think, freedom to choose. American guards made no attempt to monitor who attended religious services or to punish those who possessed Christian literature. In compounds across Geoje, chaplains held services in multiple languages, distributed Bibles, and conducted baptisms in makeshift pools filled with seawater. The contrast with communist control was absolute. What would you do if everything you'd been taught about your enemy's cruelty was revealed as lies through their kindness? As spring turned to summer 1952, the implications would become clear. The Americans weren't just housing Chinese prisoners. They were transforming them through the simple act of treating them as human beings worthy of dignity and choice. Chen Wei would soon discover that this transformation extended far beyond Sunday services, reaching into every aspect of camp life, where American democracy collided with communist doctrine. The revolution in thinking had only just begun. Please comment below where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If you're enjoying this deep dive into this incredible historical transformation, smash that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history's most fascinating moments. June 15th, 1952. The pre-dawn darkness of Geoje Island shattered as Compound 76 erupted in factional violence. Communist cadres wielding improvised clubs against prisoners who dared to attend American chapel services. This wasn't just about religion anymore. It was about the complete collapse of ideological control that had held the People's Liberation Army together. The cacophony of shouted orders, mixed with the dull thud of boots on gravel as guards rushed toward the disturbance, while the acrid smell of wood smoke from cooking fires mingled with the metallic reek of blood on rough concrete. Inside the compound, communist cell leaders had discovered that nearly 400 of their fellow prisoners were secretly attending Christian services, keeping pocket Bibles, and asking questions about Western democracy that threatened the party's absolute authority. Private Liu Xiaoming crouched behind a wooden water barrel, watching as former comrades beat each other with tent poles and mess kit handles. 3 months earlier, these same men had shared rations and foxholes along the Yalu River. Now, they were divided into camps more bitter than the war itself: those who embraced American religious freedom and those who viewed it as treasonous contamination. The communist leadership structure within the camps had been carefully maintained despite capture. Political commissars continued holding indoctrination sessions, party cells monitored prisoner behavior, and kangaroo courts dispensed brutal justice to anyone suspected of ideological wavering. The presence of American chaplains posed an existential threat to this system because it offered an alternative source of moral authority. What the Chinese prisoners discovered was that Americans didn't just allow religious worship, they actively protected it. When communist cadres attempted to prevent prisoners from attending services, American guards intervened. When religious literature was confiscated by political officers, chaplains replaced it. When believers faced intimidation, camp authorities moved them to protective compounds. This wasn't the behavior of oppressors described in Maoist propaganda. This was the conduct of captors who took Geneva Convention obligations seriously. The daily routine in the compounds revealed American organizational capacity that defied Chinese understanding of military efficiency. Reveille sounded at 5:30 each morning across all 76 compounds simultaneously. Within 30 minutes, 6,000 men in each compound had completed roll call, latrine duties, and movement to work assignments, with precision that exceeded anything most prisoners had witnessed in the People's Liberation Army. Work details varied from road construction to quarrying stone to camp maintenance, but every prisoner received identical rations regardless of work performance: 1.4 pounds of grain daily, primarily rice and barley, supplemented with dried fish and fermented vegetables. The portions were meager by American standards, but consistent and reliable, distributed without favoritism or political calculation. American abundance revealed itself in waste. Liu Xiaoming worked on a detail unloading supply ships at the island's main dock, where he witnessed American logistics that shattered every assumption about Western industrial weakness. Liberty ships arrived weekly, carrying not just prisoner rations, but complete field kitchens, medical supplies, construction materials, and thousands of tons of equipment that Americans discarded as readily as they deployed it. The guards threw away half-eaten sea rations that contained more nutrition than Liu's family in Hunan province had consumed in weeks. They operated diesel generators continuously to power electric lights in compounds where prisoners had grown accustomed to darkness after sunset. They heated water for showers when most Chinese villages lacked running water entirely. But the most profound revelation came through the screening process that began on April 11, 1952. Individual prisoners were called for interviews to determine whether they wished to be repatriated to Communist China or chose alternatives Taiwan, neutral countries, or in rare cases, remaining in South Korea. The interviews were conducted by neutral nations' representatives, but American influence was unmistakable. Prisoners who expressed interest in Christianity, democracy, or life outside communist control were treated with respect and given genuine choices. The communist cadres recognized this screening as an existential threat to their authority. If prisoners could choose their destination freely, many would reject return to Maoist control. The response was systematic intimidation, violence, and ultimately organized rebellion against camp authorities. Private Chen Wei, who had witnessed that first chapel service in April, now found himself caught between warring factions within his own compound. Communist loyalists demanded he repudiate Christianity and destroy his pocket New Testament. American chaplains offered him protection in exchange for nothing, simply recognition of his human dignity and right to choose. The choice revealed the fundamental difference between systems. Communism demanded absolute loyalty through fear. Democracy offered freedom through respect for individual conscience. For prisoners who had known only totalitarian control, this distinction was revolutionary. They could worship without permission, speak without surveillance, and choose without coercion. When Brigadier General Francis Dodd was kidnapped by communist prisoners on May 7, 1952, the entire dynamic of Geoje Island changed. The rebels who seized the camp commandant weren't protesting conditions. They were fighting against American humanity that undermined their ideological control over fellow prisoners. The irony was complete. Americans had treated enemy prisoners with such dignity that communist leaders resorted to violence to prevent their own soldiers from embracing Western values. What would you choose if offered genuine freedom for the first time in your life, knowing that choice might cost you everything? As summer 1952 deepened into crisis, the religious services continued despite compound violence. Screening interviews accelerated despite communist resistance, and thousands of Chinese prisoners faced the most profound decision of their lives: to return to the certainty of repression or embrace the uncertainty of freedom. The transformation was no longer individual. It was becoming revolutionary. October 3, 1952. Compound 27, Geoje Island. In the pre-dawn darkness, Sergeant Wang Deling knelt beside his bunk, whispering the Lord's Prayer in Mandarin, while communist guards patrolled just 50 feet away, unaware that their ideological control had already crumbled. The transformation that began with chapel services had evolved into something. American authorities never anticipated a mass spiritual awakening that would reshape the post-war balance of power in East Asia. The stale air of the overcrowded barracks carried the lingering smell of coal smoke from heating stoves, the sour tang of unwashed wool uniforms, and the metallic taste of fear as prisoners navigated between competing loyalties that could determine their fate. Wang Deling clutched a pocket New Testament hidden beneath his straw mattress, one of thousands distributed by American chaplains who continued their ministry despite escalating compound violence and the ongoing crisis sparked by General Dodd's kidnapping 5 months earlier. The resolution of the Dodd affair had revealed the fundamental weakness of communist authority within the camps. When negotiations secured the general's release in exchange for promises of improved treatment, prisoners witnessed something unprecedented. American officials who honored agreements even with enemies who had taken their commander hostage. The contrast with communist behavior was absolute. Wang had grown up in Jiangsu province, where party officials routinely broke promises, imprisoned critics, and eliminated anyone who questioned their authority. American camp administrators operated by different rules entirely. They kept their word, protected prisoners who chose Christianity, and maintained religious services even when communist factions threatened violence. The screening interviews that would determine each prisoner's destination had become exercises in profound personal choice. Individual prisoners faced neutral nation representatives in private sessions where they could express their true preferences without immediate retaliation. The questions were straightforward. Did they wish to return to Communist China? Would they prefer repatriation to nationalist Taiwan? Did they want to remain in South Korea or seek asylum in neutral countries? For men who had known only totalitarian control, the concept of genuine choice was revolutionary. Wang's interview lasted 90 minutes. The Indian representative spoke through a Korean translator, carefully explaining that his decision would be final and irreversible. No pressure was applied, no propaganda distributed. Simply an opportunity to determine his own future based on his personal convictions rather than political coercion. "I have seen what freedom means," Wang told the interviewer, his words recorded in files that would remain classified for decades. "In China, the party decided everything: where I worked, what I thought, how I worshipped. Here, American enemies treat me better than Chinese comrades. They let me choose God." The statistics emerging from the screening process shattered every assumption about Chinese communist loyalty. Of approximately 21,000 Chinese prisoners interviewed, nearly 14,000 chose repatriation to Taiwan rather than return to Mao's China. The defection rate exceeded 60%, a psychological catastrophe for communist propaganda that claimed universal support for the People's Republic. Freedom of religion had become a gateway to freedom of thought. Prisoners, who began by simply attending chapel services, discovered they could also question political doctrine, challenge economic theory, and imagine alternative futures. American chaplains inadvertently became teachers of democracy, simply by treating prisoners as individuals capable of making moral decisions. The education programs, operating alongside religious services, accelerated this transformation. Classes in English, mathematics, and civics drew thousands of participants eager to understand how American society functioned. Communist cadres recognized these sessions as existential threats to their control, but camp regulations protected educational access as rigorously as religious freedom. Wang attended literacy classes where he learned to read English phrases like individual liberty, constitutional government, and freedom of speech. The concepts themselves were foreign, but their power was undeniable. Americans lived by principles that elevated human dignity above state control, personal conscience above political loyalty. The daily rhythm of camp life reinforced these lessons through practical demonstration. American guards followed regulations rather than personal whims. Chaplains served prisoners without demanding political allegiance. Medical personnel treated illness without ideological considerations. Administrative staff processed requests fairly regardless of a prisoner's political background. This consistency of behavior revealed systemic differences that exceeded individual character. Wang worked on a road construction detail where American engineering efficiency impressed even skeptical communist loyalists. Bulldozers moved earth faster than hundreds of men with shovels. Concrete mixers produced uniform materials that exceeded anything most prisoners had seen in Chinese construction. Electric generators provided consistent power for tools that multiplied human productivity. But the most profound demonstrations came through waste management. Americans discarded equipment that Chinese armies would have treasured. They threw away food that could have fed villages. They operated machinery continuously without concern for conservation. This wasn't carelessness. It was the casual abundance of a society that produced more than it consumed. Winter 1952 brought the final test of American commitment to religious freedom. As temperatures dropped and compound tensions escalated, communist factions launched coordinated attacks on Christian prisoners, destroying Bibles, disrupting services, and threatening anyone who continued attending chapel. American response was immediate and unequivocal. Guards intervened to protect religious gatherings. Chaplains received additional security escorts. Christian prisoners were transferred to protective compounds where they could worship without intimidation. The message was clear: religious freedom would be defended regardless of political consequences. Wang found himself among 800 Chinese Christians moved to Compound 14, a facility that became known as the Bible Compound because of its concentrated population of Christian converts. Here, chapel services expanded from weekly gatherings to daily prayer meetings, Bible study groups, and theological discussions that would have been impossible under communist rule. The compound's transformation was visible from the air. Instead of political banners displaying Mao's image or communist slogans, Compound 14 featured wooden crosses carved by prisoners, biblical verses written in Chinese characters on barrack walls, and outdoor areas arranged for Christian worship. Aerial photographs taken by intelligence officers showed hundreds of men kneeling in prayer formations that spelled out words like Jesus and freedom in human letters visible from aircraft. What would you risk to keep faith that offered hope your government had denied you? By spring 1953, as armistice negotiations approached conclusion, the religious transformation of Chinese prisoners had produced consequences that extended far beyond individual conversions. Thousands of men who would have returned to China as loyal communist soldiers were now committed Christians who had chosen exile in Taiwan, South Korea, or neutral nations. The psychological warfare victory was complete, achieved not through propaganda, but through the simple demonstration of democratic values in action. American religious freedom had accomplished what military force could not: the voluntary defection of enemy soldiers who chose Western principles over communist control. July 27, 1953, Incheon Harbor, South Korea. As the armistice ending, the Korean War took effect at 2200 hours, 14,000 Chinese prisoners who had chosen Christianity over communism waited aboard transport ships that would carry them not home, but to freedom. The greatest ideological victory of the Cold War had been won not through military conquest, but through the simple act of allowing enemies to discover their own souls. The humid summer air hung heavy with diesel exhaust from idling transport vessels. The salt spray of yellow sea waves breaking against concrete piers, and the rough wool of new civilian clothes distributed to men who would never again wear the uniform of the People's Liberation Army. Operation Big Switch had begun, the massive prisoner exchange that would return 83,000 prisoners north to communist territories and 22,000 south to democratic nations. But the numbers told only part of the story. Private Wang Deling stood at the rail of the USS General Black, watching the Korean coastline recede into morning mist while clutching the pocket New Testament that had sustained him through 18 months of captivity and transformation. Around him, hundreds of former Chinese soldiers sang hymns in Mandarin, their voices carrying across the water songs that would have earned them execution in Mao's China. The statistical revolution was complete. Of 21,000 Chinese prisoners given the choice of repatriation, only 7,000 had chosen to return to communist China. The remainder, 14,000 men, had voluntarily exiled themselves rather than abandon the Christian faith they had discovered in American prison camps. This defection rate of 67% represented the greatest propaganda catastrophe in communist Chinese history. The ships themselves became floating churches as former enemies transformed into evangelists. Chaplains who had ministered to hostile prisoners 18 months earlier now conducted baptisms in converted cargo holds, where Chinese converts testified about discovering religious freedom under American captivity. The irony was, absolute communist soldiers had become Christian missionaries through the simple experience of democratic treatment. The journey to Taiwan took 4 days, during which American naval personnel witnessed something unprecedented in modern warfare: mass religious services conducted by former enemy soldiers who praised their captors' humanity. The conversions weren't forced or coerced. They emerged from prolonged observation of American behavior that contradicted every assumption about Western imperialism. Wang's diary, discovered decades later in Taipei archives, captured the profound psychological transformation that had occurred. "We came to Geoje Island as warriors for the People's Republic, believers in communist revolution, enemies of American imperialism. We learned that everything we had been taught was lies. The Americans we were told were cruel showed us kindness. The democracy we were told was weak demonstrated strength. The Christianity we were told was poison became our salvation." The medical examinations conducted during transport revealed the physical toll of captivity alongside evidence of spiritual renewal. Prisoners showed signs of malnutrition, parasitic infections, and untreated injuries from compound violence, but they also displayed remarkable psychological resilience. American military doctors noted that Christian converts exhibited lower rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress compared to prisoners returning to communist territories. Faith had become medicine for traumatized minds. The arrival in Taiwan on August 2, 1953, completed a journey that began with military defeat and ended with spiritual victory. Nationalist Chinese officials greeted the defectors as heroes who had chosen freedom over oppression, but many of the converts saw their decision in religious rather than political terms. They had discovered Christianity through American example and chosen exile to preserve their newfound faith. The integration process revealed the depth of transformation that had occurred in American camps. Former communist soldiers enrolled in theological seminaries, joined Christian congregations, and began missionary work among Taiwan's indigenous populations. The men who had once fought to destroy American influence in Asia now became advocates for American values of religious freedom and individual dignity. Wang Deling became a Presbyterian minister, establishing churches among Taiwan's mountain tribes and translating Christian literature into tribal dialects. His congregation in Taichung grew to over 2,000 members, many of whom were former Chinese soldiers who had shared his journey from communist ideology to Christian faith. The long-term consequences extended far beyond individual conversions. Taiwan's post-war development was significantly influenced by former Chinese prisoners who brought not just Christian faith, but also first-hand knowledge of American industrial methods, democratic governance, and technological innovation observed during captivity. They became interpreters between Chinese culture and Western values, facilitating Taiwan's eventual transformation into a prosperous democracy. The communist response revealed the magnitude of their ideological defeat. Beijing launched massive propaganda campaigns, claiming the defectors had been brainwashed, tortured, or deceived by American psychological warfare. The truth was more devastating. They had been treated with dignity and allowed to choose freely. Intelligence reports from the 1950s documented communist efforts to prevent future defections by indoctrinating Chinese troops with warnings about American religious manipulation. The warnings proved counterproductive, generating curiosity about Christianity among soldiers who began to wonder what faith could inspire such fear in communist leadership. The global implications rippled through Cold War competition for decades. American chaplain programs expanded throughout military operations worldwide, becoming standard components of prisoner of war operations. The Geoje Island model demonstrated that democratic values could defeat communist ideology through example rather than coercion. Religious freedom had become America's secret weapon. By the 1960s, former Chinese prisoners of war had established Christian communities across Southeast Asia, spreading both religious faith and democratic ideals among populations struggling against communist expansion. Their testimonies about American treatment during the Korean War provided powerful counter-narratives to communist propaganda about Western imperialism. Wang Deling lived until 1997, spending 4 decades as a missionary and educator who credited his spiritual awakening to American chaplains on Geoje Island. His memoir, published in 1985, became required reading in Taiwan's military academies and seminary schools. "We thought Americans were our enemies," he wrote in the final chapter. "We discovered they were our liberators, not through conquest, but through compassion, not through force, but through freedom. They defeated our ideology by demonstrating something better, the dignity that comes when human beings are allowed to choose their own relationship with God." The Chinese prisoners who discovered Christianity in American camps carried more than personal faith into exile. They became living proof that democratic values could transform even committed enemies into allies, that religious freedom could accomplish what military might could not, and that humanity shared across enemy lines could reshape the future of nations. Freedom had conquered ideology. The transformation that began with chapel services in Korean prison camps continued for generations. As converted soldiers became pastors, teachers, and democratic leaders who shaped East Asian development throughout the Cold War and beyond. Their choice to embrace Christianity over communism represented not just individual conversion, but civilization's victory over totalitarianism through the simple power of allowing enemies to discover their own souls. In the end, America's greatest triumph in the Korean War wasn't military, it was spiritual. 14,000 Chinese soldiers who experienced religious freedom under American captivity became ambassadors of democracy for the rest of their lives, proof that the most powerful weapon in freedom's arsenal is the simple act of treating enemies as human beings worthy of dignity and choice. The ships that carried them to Taiwan carried more than refugees. They carried the future of the free world.